So if you're here for the next session, it would be great if you could take your seats. And if not, I invite you to stand. Yeah, no, that's fine. Thank you. There's a lot of enthusiasm after the last group, so thank you all for coming. So we're excited to be here today to talk to you about raising the quality of healthcare delivery through emerging education technology. This is something that's relatively new here at the ASU GSV Summit. So we're just going to share some ideas with you and talk to you today, give you a chance to ask some questions at the end. So CMS predicts that healthcare's share of the GDP will raise from 17.9% in 2017 to 19.4% in 2027. And within healthcare, we're really grappling with our increasing costs, with clinical quality, with access, with equity, and patient safety. So we're here today to share what we're working on. And within the paradigm of some of those issues that I talked about, Justin, could you describe how big the problem really is within healthcare?
Yeah, I think it's pretty fascinating when you look at the problem, because I think many healthcare providers and healthcare workers don't realize the scale of the education challenges that we have within the industry. So we could look at it from a lot of different angles, but since we're talking about education, I'll talk about residency training. So after your bachelor's degree, if you want to become a physician, you go to medical school for 4 years typically, although now medical schools are slimming down some to 3 years. And then you'll do subspecialization within residency education. And for surgical training, typically this is something like 5 years of training, could be 5 to 7 years. And so there's a study from Brian George at University of Michigan in 2017 that actually looked at how well do we do when we're training residents, which is an apprenticeship training model that really hasn't changed in over 100 years. And so he looked at the ability of graduating residents after all of that education and training to be able to actually operate, to do the job that they were trained to do. And what he found that for the most common surgeries, 30.7% of graduating residents actually were unable to operate on their own and required supervision and assistance. So I think that's just one example of how the problem is escalating in severity. And the underlying problem people think is really just simple math. There's too much to learn. There's an ever increasing body of knowledge and new technologies that we need to learn to use, and decreasing time. Because of technology and using things like EMRs, we have less time to learn.
Great, thanks. So Brian, the problem is really big, and we know that healthcare providers feel the pressure on an individual level. And so what problems are you helping them solve?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the lens that Justin looks through is really from the residency training standpoint. We look at more of the professional development. And my partner and I, we take a very different approach. She comes from the entertainment industry. She was the manager of digital content distribution at Paramount Picture. I have a medical device experience, and coming in and starting our company, we really wanted to blend the best practices from entertainment and education. So what that means is we want to provide access to medical professionals on a global scale. And what we actually do is we go out and we find the subject matter experts at the top academic medical centers. We then create that content in the most compelling fashions. Right now that's 4K and 360 VR. And then we stream that on demand. Our philosophy is that everyone should be able to learn from the best, and we're proud to say that Mayo Clinic is our main partner in achieving that goal. So our hopes is to have the largest library of medical lectures in the world, and the thought really is now all medical professionals can learn from the best, access any relevant lecture to them in a timely manner, really instead of physically having to go to a conference space to stay up to date with their information.
Yeah, I'm going to probe. Justin, how about you? What problems are you trying to solve?
So we work in two main market segments. One is with the medical device industry, and their main challenge is that as these incredible technologies that provide value to patients, and what value means in healthcare is better patient outcomes, so patients do better for every unit of treatment that they receive, and decrease cost. So things like the Da Vinci surgical robot, navigation technologies, 3D printed patient-specific devices, things that you may have heard of, are actually harder to use. They're more complicated and require more training. And so these companies are having difficulty selling their technology because us as surgeons, we actually don't know how to use it because it's too complicated. And the old model of where they actually fly us to hotels like this and have us train in a ballroom on cadavers, which is really shocking, often before weddings. You should look up an article in Reuters called Cadavers in the Ballroom. It's really entertaining and interesting. But it's not enough because these procedures you have to do hundreds of times before you can do it safely. And we're basically doing it once and then a few months later doing it on a patient. And that's not going to go very well. So we provide a simulation platform using just video game technology. We use off-the-shelf virtual reality, mainly on Oculus Rift, to allow their customers, surgeons, surgical staff, to practice these procedures as a team as many times as they need to reach proficiency. So we also have an assessment system that actually assesses when they're ready. On the residency side, we're also partnered with a lot of leading hospitals like Vanderbilt, Columbia, UCSF, UCLA, on providing education to solve the problem on the front end, getting people more ready to exit in the world of surgical training. So we're also creating curriculums for them, allowing us to standardize education. Because a lot of education within medicine, I'm sure you can comment on this, is just really based on statistics. It's based on what patient comes in that day. So to give you an example, one of my co-residents when I was training to become a surgeon, he was on a rotation for hand surgery. And one of the most common things we take care of, which is a distal radius fracture that everyone should know how to do, he actually never saw once just because no one was skateboarding for those few months or something like that. So he went off into the world never having done this surgery that in some cases is life-saving, that we really need to be able to establish standards that we're helping with.
Yeah. Mary Ellen, what problems are you trying to solve?
So I think there's something I'd like to add to what Justin said in the beginning. I'm finding I have to turn this way in order to get my mic working. But I think there's a key component to changing the way our subject matter experts know how to communicate to this generation of learners. Right now, a big fear that we have is that there's a chasm between the wisdom, the people that are about to exit their careers, and the people coming in. And the way that they learn is drastically different. And no one's really converged those two markets. So we really look at it two ways. We not only have to change and elevate the experience of the learner, but we have to get that expert to understand that they need to change the way they teach. And so that's part of our core methodology, is make sure that they're understanding adult learning principles. It's not about didactic lectures, and that they're coming through in a way that enables the learner to access content in micro-learning experiences that can be accessed on the go while they're moving, as they have questions. And it can be while they're waiting at a dry cleaner or while they're at the gym. But being able to, one, help that subject matter expert bring their intel to the next generation in an effective way, and engage the learner in the way that they've been learning since they were small children, right? In a way that they can access and believe in, and help the wisdom-filled folks understand that there's no way that this generation can memorize everything. And there's a resentment right now that they don't have, that they have more quality of life, they spend more time with their kids, and there's just this big chasm, and someone has to break that down. And I think by working with the teachers, it's a critical component to changing that and getting them to have a little more empathy for this next generation, and the fact that this next generation is not going to change how they learned because they've been doing it since they were young children. Right. I think that, and I think the other thing that we believe is the assessment aspect and the learning aspect have to be inextricably linked. So we believe, as a physician, you have a patient's life in your hand. You have to make sure that you are confident that you can make a quick decision, and inevitably that translates to oftentimes having inaccurate self-assessment. And as adult learners, we tend to go after the things that we like. We tend to avoid the things that we don't like. Well, so what we are religious about is making sure they understand where they stand relative to competency and where they stand relative to their peers. And that's what drives this, moves from sort of an extrinsic motivation into an intrinsic motivation. And they get into that content that they need to get into. And we're big on applied learning, making sure you're thinking about their residency and the C1, do one, right? And being able to get them to teaching one is where the highest level of retention is. So those are the core concepts that sort of flow through our methodology of developing content.
Yeah, Justin.
I think there's so many good points there, but there's one I just really want to emphasize that I think very few people realize. And this is mainly on the surgical end of the spectrum because we do get assessed constantly with multiple choice exams. But when it comes to technical skills, what we're doing to people, we actually never get assessed. So, whether you're applying to be a surgical care provider, a procedural care provider like an interventionist, whether you're in training or whether afterwards, technical skill assessment is not part of our certification or education, which is absolutely bonkers because we now know that the outcome of the patient, which is the most important thing, is directly correlated with the skill of the provider. So this is really something we should be measuring, and there are many reasons why we don't and many problems, and part of it is also just some of the taboo surrounding this. But just as a personal story, I was sort of assessed once when I was interviewing for residency, and they had me play the board game Operation with the buzzing. But I mean, I'm happy they did it because it's like at least somebody checked something, and so it's very interesting. And I think there's a podcast called Dr. Death that is sort of an extreme example of what happens when you don't just check on the ability of the provider to provide basic technical care, and it could go quite south.
Yeah, I mean, to kind of piggyback off of 2 points you guys both made, medical education is really high stakes. Patients' lives are at matter here, and it's important that you get the most important information, the most up-to-date information to these medical professionals. I mean, everyone here in the audience is here because they believe in the value of education. But for medical education specifically, I think we have to remember that the behaviors are still very similar. And so talking about the generational issues, ultimately these folks that are learning today want to consume their content online, they want access immediately, and they want to get answers immediately. So, how we approach the content, and a couple things that we've learned in the development, our initiative has been really two things. One is to film and index every surgical procedure and every specialty, both in 4K and 360 VR. And then the second part is to build the largest library of medical lectures in the world. And around the medical lectures aspect, a lot of conferences, a lot of societies will repurpose the conference lectures and put it online. But the online consumer tells us that that isn't beneficial to them. What they're looking for is 2 to 3 key points that they can look on their mobile device, take it home, and then apply it in their personal lives or in their practice. So we have to spend a lot of time coaching the subject matter experts, the academic medical centers, those that are educators, saying like, look, you have to rethink this for the younger generations and create content for an online audience. And that has been a challenging item on our end, but we've seen a lot of momentum and a lot of reception as of last year with that.
Right. Yeah, I don't think most people realize that medical students coming, fresh from their medical school graduation can literally the next week go right into an OR and be operating. And so building up those skills is important, but it's also expensive. And it's difficult to get in the hands of the people that need it. So you want to talk a little bit about the expense and the access?
Well, I think, we could talk about access in a few different lenses, because for us, democratization of surgical education is very important. And there are low and middle income areas, both in the country but also in the world and countries, that don't have any surgical education whatsoever, and they're just sort of winging it, and they have very capable people, but if they only had access to these resources, we could improve the care in those regions by cutting infant mortality, maternal mortality, and things like that. But when it comes to medical school, the actual day-to-day practice of healthcare has changed so drastically from when medical school first became instituted after the Flexner reports, as we know it today, that the whole purpose of medical school and what the goal is to me, pretty unclear. After about 4 years of education and tremendous expense, you don't have a whole lot of useful skills typically for your specialty, because typically what most people are doing now is so super subspecialized that you're not learning almost any of that in medical school at all. And you're definitely not operating as a medical student. I mean, you're standing in the corner, maybe you'll get to hold a leg if you're lucky, but you're paying full time to stand in an operating room and not see anything for like 14 hours. And today's generation is just not tolerating it at all. And so that's why you see programs like NYU, is now completely free, which is awesome. And now it's 3 years, but I really think it should be 2 years. Or a system more like the UK where it's integrated with undergraduate education, because we really need to get people to the part where they're learning the things that they actually need to know. In one of my first weeks as a surgical intern, I was called into a patient's room. He goes, "Doctor, I'm very anxious and I feel like I'm going to throw up. He just had surgery." And a nurse is there with me, and I looked at him right in the eyes and I went, "I hope you feel better." And I walked out of the room, and the nurse was like, "Well, do you want to give him any medication for that?" And I was like, "There's medication for that? That's amazing. Yeah. What is it? Tell me." I knew nothing.
Yeah.
I knew nothing about the actual practice of healthcare. I knew about like the genetic inheritance of schizophrenia and various oddball concepts that people were doing research on, but not how to take care of patients.
Yeah. So VR technology, we're seeing that more and more within medical education. And both Brian and Justin, you're offering VR. So it's interesting to me, are you seeing large-scale adoption? Because what I've noticed is that with the introduction of that type of technology, there can be pushback, skepticism. Early adopters receive a lot of resistance. So where are we with that technology? I don't know, Brian, if you want to start.
Actually, Justin, I mean, he's more of a full VR company,
Okay.
so I'd love to hear his thoughts there.
Great.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting because it's very easy to just be like, well, VR is VR and it's this thing, and I have this opinion of it. And that's probably the most common reaction we get today is, I've tried VR and I don't think it's helpful. But I tell people, it's like you read a bad book, and you're not going to say all books are bad, right? So try this approach at VR surgical training. And so pretty much most people, when they try our VR training and assessment experiences, like 100 across the board, like, "Oh, I see now, this makes a lot of sense." So really getting people behind the headset is really critical. But I think in healthcare in particular is a bit different than other industries, partially because of the patient-facing VR applications. So I don't know if some of you have seen some of the work that's being done by Stanford or companies like Applied VR, but the effect that these can have on patients is really life-changing. For example, I'm a pediatric orthopedic surgeon, so I take care of children. When we're bringing them into surgery, one of the first things we do is we put an IV in them. But this is really traumatic for some children, as I'm sure you all know. They don't like needles. And so sometimes we'll have to anesthetize them before putting the IV in, which is a really traumatizing process for the child and for everybody, because you have to forcefully hold a gas mask on their face while they're going to sleep. It's terrifying. But if you just put a VR headset on them, and then you can put an IV in, they don't even notice. And it's just totally changed everybody's life. So what we're seeing is that many people are coming up to us and being like, "Oh, virtual reality, we use this in our hospital quite extensively. How is it being used for training and assessment?" So there's a lot more openness to this technology because of some of the patient-facing applications. I think also the problems are so huge that everybody clearly sees the need for technology like this, even though it's not. The most common feedback we get is that on the feel level, on the haptic feedback, it's not 100%. But we think that's one of the biggest advantages because this does certain things very well, and then we let that part of the hands-on training, other modalities kind of take the place of it. So people are seeing the advantage now that you can buy a $400 VR headset and train on any surgery and get assessed as well.
Great.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit more skeptical around virtual reality as a technology, which is interesting from a strategic standpoint because we're heavily investing in the technology. We hear a lot of companies and a lot of advocates for it say that it's just a couple years away. We've seen vast improvements of the technology. Facebook is coming out with a new headset that's untethered, which was a big problem for early VR adopters. You had to have a headset attached to a computer, and that just isn't a great user experience. This is a perfect example. I mean, I imagine raise your hand here if you've worn a VR headset before. And then how many of you guys have worn it 2 times? Keep your hands up. And then how about 5 times? So right there, hands drastically go down. What that tells me is that there's a big problem around the content itself. People see the vision. There's no doubt that we believe that all the medical students and all the nursing students in the future are going to wear a headset as part of their training process. We just don't know how long it's going to take. So we're building the library. We're doing 360 videos just because we want to kind of hedge our bet and make sure that we have a library when that adoption takes place. But for companies like Justin that invest a lot of money into the gaming technologies and the animation, it's really expensive to do so, and we just don't want to place a lot of our investments in that area right now. I think from a medical school standpoint and residency program, we have some customers that use it early on. And again, it comes back to the engagement standpoint. Everyone goes, wow, for the first time. We get a lot of great feedback about what it looks like right now. But one of the biggest problems is you have people that have expectations like Star Wars or Star Trek and think that that's what VR should be. And so you have a difficult time getting them back in there. So I think the technology is still a long ways away, but we're excited about companies like OssoVR and what they're doing so we can piggyback off of that success down the road.
Yeah, I think I'll just jump in there. I think there is definitely an engagement problem when it comes to any learning technology. It's not unique to VR. I think it's, what we've seen in my space when I was training as a surgeon at Harvard, they rolled out a mobile-based learning technology, which is super accessible. You could use anywhere. It was very accurate and comprehensive. But what the residents reported and fellows is that they could just Google, like there's a website that we use called OrthoBullets, for example, where it just has the list of steps to the procedure, and it's effectively the same thing. It's just much faster, higher yield, as you say, which people really crave nowadays. And so if people had to choose between something that would take like 5 minutes or something that would take 20 seconds, and really was about the same in terms of effectiveness, then they'd go with the one that's easier to access. And that's what it's all about, effectiveness. And so that's what we wanted to understand very early on is, how well does this actually work? I don't want to just assume that this is helpful for people. And so we did a study where we took 20 medical students, 10 were trained in virtual reality to proficiency, and 10 were trained with traditional means, which is lectures, technique guides, figures, and illustrations. Then we had them do a real-world version of the procedure, and we filmed every performance. We then had a blinded expert observer grade each individual's performance, and what we found was the performance of the VR-trained individuals was 230% better than non-VR trained individuals. So I can say that the ultimate motivation of our user is patient safety, outcomes, and being better at surgery and feeling confident. And so if they can have a technology that they're confident is going to get those skills, then they are much more likely to engage with it, and that's what we're seeing it. We train over 1,000 surgeons a month. We're seeing repeat users, and I've seen it firsthand. I've seen people train in VR for an hour straight because they just keep going through and keep wanting to get slightly better and taking different angles of attack. So I think engagement is the biggest problem with any sort of learning or training and assessment technology, but it has to be effective, it has to be engaging, and then it also has to be integrated. So that's the last thing I'll say is it can't be an extra thing on the side, like here's this thing that you can use if you want to. There should be a reason to use it. And so for us, we've partnered with the Hospital for Special Surgery, which in my field is the #1 program in the country for orthopedic surgery, actually is mandatory to use OssoVR as part of your training and assessment for certain curriculums. So that's how we're tackling, but that is definitely a very real challenge and a very real concern.
So I'm in total agreement. I think the applied aspect of learning not only builds skills, but it builds confidence, both of which is essential. I think it's especially critical in the surgical space. As you look into some of the other areas, it becomes a nice to have, but not necessarily a need to have. So there's a lot of very contemporary technology that you can engage that leverages the physician to work through a case study. So we have, for example, echocardiograms that come up, and you do the patient case, and then they have to mark it. We do echoes, angios, ECGs, so that they're going through, and then they're hearing the expert come through and code that exact same patient. So they're able to make diagnoses and think through it and actually be able to connect back with the expert if they need to. And they can reflect back and see how they coded that patient versus how the expert coded the patient. So there's sort of a low fidelity way that you can get that experience, and especially if you get somebody in a non-urban setting that doesn't have the complexity of patients, but they want to keep their skills up. There's sort of technology that's at our fingertips right now. It's very affordable. It just means as educators, we have to think in a practical manner. We have to be able to get in the physician's shoes and know what they struggle with and know how we can support them on the go. And I think there's real world application that you can replicate through technology without using AR or VR right now.
Yeah, I think with distance learning technologies like MOOCs and things like that, part of what you lose when someone's not at school, and I'm seeing this in med school all the time, like 9 people show up to lecture now. Like I have to imagine that in-person lecture is just going out the window. But part of going to class or being at school for a semester is that accountability, is the fact that there's someone like watching you or that you want to impress on the other end of it. And I think a lot of digital technologies are definitely, it makes sense from a scalability standpoint to be self-directed for the most part, or maybe having someone tracking your ability. But what if you could actually still have that component of being with someone that you really respect and trust on the other end? So the way we're tackling this is we do something called collaborative training. So in virtual reality, you can connect people independent of their physical location. So we've done trainings where surgical experts in China have trained people here in the US, and they're together. And so what we're doing is we have people, whether it's your instructor or a famous surgeon, schedule an appointment for surgical training in virtual reality, but they're both in different states or across the country. And then those people are really excited to meet this person, spend some time with them, even though it's in a virtual space. And so they want to show up and they want to be there because they have a really strong goal in addition to all the educational value that's provided. So kind of bridging the gap to these new technologies by utilizing some of the concepts of more traditional education and training.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with like some of these digital education tools, one important factor that all of us need to think about is how do we provide real-time feedback to the individuals that are involved, and that'll help with the engagement issues, especially in the VR component, and bringing in questions and providing feedback on how that individual did, because that is one of the challenges, as you mentioned, in the classroom, having that mentor right there, working in the lab, you get that type of feedback. When you go on all digital strategy, you tend to lose that type of interaction. And so I think for us as kind of innovators in this space, we need to figure that out.
I think you're veering into a really exciting topic, I think, especially in healthcare, but also in other spaces, and it's the concept of coaching. You know, when you're looking at high-performance individuals in most industries or like sports, regardless of your level of mastery, you always have someone who's watching you and providing feedback so that you can constantly strive to improve your performance. Yet in healthcare in particular, this is notoriously absent, especially for physicians, where once you've done like your 3 to 5 years of training, you're just presumed to be a world-class expert and require no other supervision or feedback whatsoever, which is completely nuts. And I think, you know, on some level we don't want that because we're scared. We don't want people to see us screw up, but I think we really do want that feedback. And so it's really impractical to have another surgeon, you know, given all the constraints that we have, watch your performance or even watching videos of it. But technology has a way of providing that feedback, getting input on, you know, just how did I do? How can I do better next time? Or even on a professional level, like burnout is such a huge problem in our industry. And it's been shown that having a coach can really significantly help with that, much more so than mindfulness and meditation, which have been the primary solutions offered right now.
One comment I wanted to make on that, and it was funny because we did an analysis on our videos and seeing like who actually was watching the videos, specifically talking about the surgical videos. And this was about a year ago, but when we looked at a physician's video and we looked at the users that were watching it, the person that watched the video the most was that own person that was doing the surgery. And it goes to that point of, it wasn't out of vain, it was actually because they just wanted to go back and they were thinking how they could improve, they wanted to learn from it. And we knew this because they would come back and say, hey, we don't want to use that video anymore, I'd prefer to redo this procedure, and there's areas that I can improve. And I think with physicians, because it's high stakes, physicians' lives are on the line, and these are ultra competitive, extremely you know, lifelong learners, that this behavior is really interesting to see. And
I think this is probably like way off topic for this group, but you bring up an interesting point, which is like the patient's point of view, right? And I always tell this to people, is that like when people are like, oh, I heard this surgeon's great, I'm so excited to get surgery from it. I'm like, what are you basing that decision off of? You know, is it because they have valet parking, or he's nice, or the people at the front desk are nice? Because that's actually typically what people are basing their decisions off of. I mean, obviously they've never seen this person operate or have no concept of the technical competency. And so having exposure of that instead of like Yelp reviews or health grades on some level would be so nice for patients to know that they're just getting quality care no matter who they're seeing.
Yeah, I always ask the nurse, who would you have do your surgery? I'll take a quick question.
They can, so that's where the benefit of working with an outside company is, as long as you don't integrate with their technology and it's information they get from the outside, legally they're actually okay, especially if that communication goes right to the practitioner.
Yeah, I think there's one company that really has addressed that particular challenge really well. It's called CSATs. It was acquired by Johnson & Johnson, but that was a really big concern early on for them. They were able to, I think you can make the argument that this is in the service of patient safety and should not be. No, I think, I don't know the details of it, but I think that it is privileged communication that it would not be exposed during that kind of situation. I've been involved in lawsuits and depositions before, and that kind of information has not come up, like my personal track record or performance, but rather it's mainly around what actually happened to the patient and that documentation.
I think, what you want to look at is the enterprise sales model and the construct of that contract, and what information goes to who and when and how. And we're working with a large healthcare system talking about that, and there's ways that keep the hospital clean. They just can't own the data, which is in fact exactly what people like us want. So it's a win-win situation.
Great. All right, so I'd like to take us way into the future. I know at Mayo Clinic we're watching and trying to forecast what are the trends in healthcare. We're interested in, movement toward a single payer system. We're watching what technology is bringing. We're looking at how patients are traveling for their care and what this will really look like. And so we're thinking, toward the future that physicians will really need to have a completely different set of skills than they do today. And just to be a little bit provocative, to say that in the future, it's a possible paradigm shift that it's going to be based on virtual care, and that technology is really going to be the underpinning of most everything that we do. Now, you may or may not agree with that, because some of the physicians at Mayo Clinic would really push back and say, it's that face-to-face interaction and relationship that makes the difference. But we are also at the forefront of some of the technology that we're thinking could be the trends for the future. E-consults, virtual care. We've done research on listening, analyzing patients' voices and utilizing that for actual diagnosis of heart disease, for instance. So there's a struggle with an uncertainty, but let's just suppose that in the future, almost everything is going to be virtual care, and the amount of information that's available at your fingertips is going to be absolutely enormous. If you think about that provider and what we know about our learners today and what this might look like in the future, what do you think is going to be, what would you be aiming for with education, and what's going to be important?
Well, I think a couple of things there. One is that it really doesn't matter whether physicians think, the face-to-face time is valuable or not, because the reality of the fact is that there's going to be way too few of us and way too many patients in just a few years. The American Association of Medical Colleges estimates we're going to be 130,000 physicians short in just a decade, and that problem becomes magnified by quite a bit a few years after that. And part of the problem is that residency and graduate medical education is funded by Medicare. And that funding has been frozen as of the 1997 Budget Act, which effectively caps the number of physicians that we can train. But there are other problems too, but that's part of it. So a lot of what we do in healthcare is going to need to be virtualized and automated, and in surgery, robotics is one of the main way we're looking at automating this, and empowering sort of easier to train individuals like mid-level providers, physician assistants, and nurse practitioners is probably going to be something we're seeing a lot more of. I think, from the overabundance of knowledge and information, and how do we train people and give them access to it and decision support, we're already seeing this today in the oncology space. The speed and pace of that research is such that it exceeds the human potential of understanding. And so we need technology to be able to tell us what would be best for this patient, because there's thousands of new studies and clinical trials going on in any given day, and no human being could possibly sift through all that. And it's hard to do, and there have been several attempts at it, and now more successful ones, but I think, IBM Watson had a rather spectacular I don't want to say failure, but didn't go so well. So it's definitely a challenging problem to solve. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think it's a great case study of what is probably going to spread into other fields as things become, just exponentially more complex.
Yeah. Well, so from our perspective, technology is never going to replace physicians or any type of caregivers. Technology is going to be tools that help them take better care of their patients, to make better decisions. The problem that we see is there's so many tools out there that are coming to market that include things like virtual reality, augmented reality, artificial intelligence, and this is just the beginning. And as that exponentially increases, that becomes overwhelming for the physicians. Now, what we've seen is, especially for the younger generations, they are inherently a little bit more open to these technologies. They know how to use them. It's a little bit more intuitive. But at a systemic level, when it's the faculty and the folks that are still teaching these students, or the younger trainees, they don't know how to integrate these technologies into their practice. And so there has to be some type of change at a foundational level to start introducing these technologies to people younger on. But I think it's just a generational gap that's going to limit a lot of the effectiveness of the tools that are coming out.
Yeah, I think that's a really active question right now, is like, whose responsibility is it to set the standards and solve these problems? And there's so many different players, and it's really unclear at the moment. Is it hospital systems, institutions like Kaiser? They have the ability to make broad and change, and they've been pretty effective. Is it professional organizations like the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons, the American Medical Association, the ACGME? Are they going to make some of these changes? Is it the medical device industry, as they own more and more of the sort of episodic care or pharma? They're selling now not only like drugs or devices, but software and technology that improves patient care and delivers value to the system? Or is it going to be more on the individual level, and just like we're doing now, it's like, I find a technology I find incredibly useful for my patients, so I use it. Like, every single physician uses Hippocrates, and no one's telling us that we have to use it, but we all do because it works incredibly well. So I don't think there's going to be any one segment or person that's going to solve it, but definitely there are a few different ways to sort of implement and make change and set standards. And you're seeing groups like the Consumer Technology Association now is even involved, and I'm part of something called the Health and Fitness Technology Division. We're setting standards in the use of AI and its use in healthcare. So it's pretty interesting and fascinating who's going to drive this change, because there's so many tools and technologies available. On the individual level, it is quite overwhelming.
Right.
I still think we have an antiquated approach with this sort of studying for your boards and to the board. I mean, that whole concept that it still lives is really a little silly, but it still drives a lot of physician behavior, because that's the group that's in control of identifying competency. The reality is those exams that they come out with lag at least 3 years practice protocols. So it's already outdated the day the exam's being taken by 3 years, not by a short, it's a long time.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be the piece that is already in flux. They're trying to figure it out. There's a ton of lawsuits going on. So I think we have to think of it as two sets of curriculum. There's the evidence-based curriculum, depending on whether you're a T or an I, right, a generalist or a specialist. That evidence base, you have to stay fresh. You have to stay on top of, right? And then there's the emerging medicine, which everyone is struggling with, and knowing where are the trials going, what's going to impact me, how do I make sure I'm bringing my patient the very best. And it's about us learning how to integrate those curriculum and let us bring it into the physician based on what they specifically know that we can identify through their EHR behavior, and really start to get to them on the fly. And most importantly, think about that curriculum from the ground up, from the interdisciplinary team. I mean, care has, which is different than multidiscipline, right? And focusing on the deep education, but realizing the complexity of healthcare is no longer about one, right? The interdiscipline grand rounds that happen right now, rounding that's happening. We have to develop curriculum that supports that behavior and lets them understand what they know and what they don't know, and how when do you bring in the nutritionist? When do you bring in these, the social worker, right? The broader set of skills that are gonna coach that patient to also be compliant, because that's part of our challenge in healthcare. Right. So I think technology can help pull all that through data, through AI, and it's sort of about the first person to get there right now.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you all. We've got 1 minute. Does anybody have a quick question? I think we have, okay. Oh, great.
I work for Next Step Careers, and we provide credentialing for
there's a company called Embodied Labs you should definitely look into. They do empathy-based training for elderly and cognitive decline care, especially for entry-level positions in terms of empathizing with those patients and learning what they're going to deal with on a day-to-day basis. They're doing some really cool stuff.
Great, thank you.
Embodied Labs.
Great.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, panel.